Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for that incredibly kind welcome. Thank you also to you, Sundar, for what you are doing at the Fabians. And you are an incredibly important part of the way we need to move forward as a political party. And as part of the masochism strategy that oppositions employ after general elections, I noticed you devote quite a lot of your issue to people slagging off the tradition of the Fabians, which is something I suppose we should approve of in some senses. But I want to congratulate you for what you are doing. I've had obviously an interesting few months, as some of you will recognize. Actually, recently I was meeting the governor of the Bank of England, which you do from time to time in this job. And Alan Johnson and I had a good chat with him. And after about 3/4 of an hour of a chat, I was slightly alarmed because a lady in a pink uniform that they wear at the Bank of England sort of rushed in with a note to him. And he looked impassively at the note and we carried on talking. And then a couple of minutes later, the lady rushed in again with a second note. And I thought to myself, 2 notes to the governor of the Bank of England during a meeting, that's obviously not a great sign. And I said, look, Governor, if things are difficult and if there's something else, some urgent business you have to attend to, please don't let us detain you. Because I was thinking, what could this possibly be? A financial crisis, sovereign debt crisis, what's happening? He said, it's rather embarrassing, really. And I said, why? It's the cricket schools? And he said, no. He said, the first note said, do remember to ask Ed Miliband whether it's a good idea to stay at the Four Seasons in Palo Alto. And I said, Governor, what did the second note say? He said, I'm afraid we made a mistake. It was David Miliband who stayed at the Four Seasons in Palo Alto. Look, last night it's a true story, I promise. Last night we witnessed our first by-election of the Parliament in Oldham East and Saddleworth. And it was... It was an unusual by-election, not only because I'm proud to say Labour won, which hasn't been necessarily the recent history, but also because of the behaviour of our opponents and the churning of votes between the parties. I think David Cameron became the first Prime Minister, as he said yesterday, to go and campaign in a by-election. I think he's also the first party leader in recent memory who couldn't remember the name of his candidate in a by-election. And we've also had Nick Clegg, both before and after the by-election, vowing he's going to have more public rows with David Cameron in order to assert his own identity. I have to say, I don't think that's a great way to conduct the relationship of government. I think it is a symptom of having a coalition based on political convenience rather than one based on values. It was also an unusual by-election because we saw significant transfer of votes from the Liberal Democrats to Labour, from the Conservatives to the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives to Labour. But above all, what I think Oldham East and Saddleworth shows is that people are deeply uneasy about the direction in which this Conservative-led government is taking the country. However, and this is my argument today, our party would be deluding ourselves if we thought that this meant the next election will fall into our lap. The next election will be as much about us as about them, and our ability to change and become the standard bearer of the progressive majority in this country. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because I believe that from the very founding of the Labour Party, as the Labour Representation Committee, through to the great reforming Labour governments of the second half of the 20th century, and the early years of this century, Labour has succeeded when it has seen itself not as a narrow sectional party interest, but when through a sense of mission, passion and optimism, we have stood for that progressive majority that exists in Britain and which I believe does exist in Britain. But we need to be honest that over 13 years of government, in many people's minds, we forfeited the right to be the standard bearer of that progressive majority. And I'm not going to let a by-election victory, important though it was, distract me from the essential path that we need to take and the essential reckoning we have to make with our record in government, both successes and failures. And I want to talk today about the reasons why we lost that progressive standard, and about the way we need to change, and change profoundly to put it right. The first is to understand why our economy stopped working for people, and how we can again offer a new economic model for Britain. In particular, understanding this point, and this dates back well before the last Labour government, actually to Tony Crosland, that simply redistributing taxpayers' money through the welfare state, important though I believe that is inadequate and will not build the just, more sustainable economy we believe in. That's the first point. The second is to recognise the way our managerialism took us away from the progressive instincts of the British people. That our communities sometimes came to see us as the people who put markets and commerce before the common good. And many citizens at the same time came to see us as a people who did not understand that the state could be intrusive as well as empowering. We must respond to this by breathing new life into our sense of ideological purpose, drawing on what is enduringly good in the Labour tradition, but also, and this is an important part of my argument, reaching outside our traditions as well. And that's why the front cover of the Fabian Review and what the Fabians are doing is, I think, important. And third, we must accept that in the way we came to do our politics, we came to be leaders not of a broad progressive movement built on a coalition of values, but into a political force that was far less than that. We must respond by putting democratic renewal and a willingness to reach out to others beyond this party at the heart of the way we do politics. Understanding that Labour must change the way it works and that no one party can claim to have a monopoly of wisdom in today's politics. That we must earn our leadership of the progressive majority that I talk about. We don't get it by right. So that's my argument. Let me set out, before I talk about it in greater detail, the context. 2 years ago, I opened the Fabian New Year Conference of 2009. And in thinking about this speech, I look back, as you do, at the previous speeches you gave, including that one. I thought it was not a bad speech. I said then that the Tories had never been more on the ideological defensive than at any time in my political lifetime. Things have changed. At that point, the financial crash had demolished the conservative fallacy that markets would always produce good outcomes, and David Cameron was talking about how he did believe in society and all of that. 2 years later, we are clearly in a different place. David Cameron didn't win the general election last May, but he did end up as Prime Minister. And he has shown a determination to ensure that even though he didn't get a mandate, it won't stop him launching the most ideologically dangerous, in my view, assault on the welfare state that we've seen in generations. I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say that we see all around us an assault on many of the things that we value. From Sure Start to what's happening to local libraries, to the trebling of student debt, to all of those things. The combination of this assault on the things we value, the global economic crisis, and the formation of a coalition government it marks a change, a profound moment, which I think you only get to see once in a generation. And that's an important part of the context to this speech and to this moment. I can think of two other moments in my political lifetime that are similar, and I think we can draw some lessons from those moments. When I say I can remember them, I don't want you to think I was a sort of political train spotter at the age of 6. The first was the IMF crisis in 1976 and the winter of discontent 2 years later, followed by the defeat of the Callaghan government, the formation of the SDP, and 18 years of Conservative government. That was one moment that shaped politics for a long time to come. The second was Britain's ejection from the exchange rate mechanism in 1992, the formation of New Labour in 1994, and the election of a Labour government in 1997. In both cases, a fundamental shift in the character and direction of our national politics proved to be enduring. On these two occasions, a governing party lost power on the expectation of a quick return to office and it ended up in the wilderness for a generation. Now, what lesson do I conclude from that? In both cases, it was because they didn't learn the right lessons about the changing economic circumstances, about what the situation said about their values, and about the way they did their politics. That's why we must seize this moment to understand these lessons and to change if we are to ensure this is a one-term government. It is the changes we make to ourselves that will decide whether we avoid the fate that has befallen parties in the past. One more heave won't do. And I particularly say this given the general election result. We got 29% of the vote, our second worst showing since universal suffrage. Now, of course, I'm proud of the achievements of our last Labour government. And I think the truth is that for a lot of people, those achievements are clearer now that they are under threat from this government. But let's not mislead ourselves. Aspects of this record in government are also the reason we are now in opposition. Parties don't suffer defeats like the one we suffered because simply of an accumulation of small errors. They do so by making serious mistakes. And that's why I've said what I've said on issues like Iraq, failing to properly regulate the banks, ignoring concerns about economic security, and not delivering on the new politics. We have to show we have learnt lessons if people are to trust us again. So that is the scale of the challenge we face. And that might sound a bit downbeat, but I think there's something else that's important, which is a cause for optimism. Because if the result of the election showed why we need to change, it also reveals something important about the nature of British politics from which we ought to draw encouragement. Most people cast their votes for parties that talked about making our society fairer and more equal. Most people cast their votes for parties that said that there were dangers of cutting the deficit too far and too fast. Most people cast their vote for parties that said we needed to comprehensively reform our politics. It is easy to forget today, but that brief bout of what you might call Cleggmania was animated by this progressive hunger for change. So there is a progressive majority in Britain. It's just that we failed to attract enough of it to our cause. And that's the point. We will rebuild ourselves successfully as a broad movement in this country by understanding where the true centre ground of politics lies. We've got to become the voice and hope of those who feel squeezed by an economic system that promised to liberate them. We've got to articulate the frustration of people who are fed up with bankers taking vast public subsidies and then rewarding themselves for failure while the rest of the country struggles. We've got to be the party that answers the call for a fairer sharing of the nation's wealth, strong and responsive public services, and a different kind of politics. That's why I'm an optimist, because I think that's where the true centre ground of politics lies. It's just that we didn't become the vehicle for people's hopes and aspirations at the last election. Now, over the coming months, I'm going to talk in greater detail about how we approach the economic challenges we face, the challenge of renewing our values, and the challenge of renewing our politics. But today I want to set out the direction of that journey. Let me start with the first change that I think we need, which is on the economy, and say something about that. The financial crisis shook the world economy. But more specifically, it exposed some of the flawed assumptions on which the economic policies of governments of both parties had based their work. The election saw a majority, in my view, crying out for a party and a government which had learned the lessons of the crisis and could offer Britain a new economic future. But we must accept that we failed to win the argument that it was us that could offer people a better economy working in their interests. Now, why was that? Well, if you listen to the Conservative-led government, they say that it was high levels of public borrowing that caused the crisis. And somehow it's our failure to accept that fundamental point that meant that we couldn't articulate people's sense about the economy of the future. I don't agree with that. It's not true. In fact, it was the economic crisis that caused high levels of public borrowing. The deficit rose from manageable levels of 2% of national income to above 10% because of the global financial crisis. And the reason I've started the year talking about this issue is that we must not let the Tories and the Liberal Democrats get away with propagating this myth. The reason is not simply because of desire for truth about the past, but because they are using it to shape our future. They want to tell people that the only lesson we need to learn is that as long as we cut as far and as fast as we can, we will somehow then get back to the sunny uplands of economic spring. But just as we need to counter their myth about the past, we need to acknowledge what we got wrong. Along with other national governments, we didn't get banking regulation right. And our economy was too vulnerable to the crisis because we were too reliant on financial services. These are two important lessons of the crisis, which I've talked about before. But there is a deeper issue, which I haven't said so much about, which I think is important. And that's about why the crisis happened and what it teaches us about the economy we need to create. Freer markets, combined with light-touch regulation, were sold to Middle Britain on the basis they would guarantee economic freedom, rising living standards, and a fair reward for the hard-working majority. For the best of reasons, New Labour signed up to this vision, because it spoke to the hopes of aspirational voters. And our period in office was marked by notable successes. Record levels of employment, a decade of continuous growth until 2008, low inflation, low interest rates, the minimum wage. And we used the proceeds of growth to rebuild public services and tackle poverty. But economic growth and rising productivity masked a hidden truth, that life in the middle was getting harder, not easier. Because real wages in the middle may have been rising, but they weren't keeping pace with the rest of the economy. And they were wildly outstripped by the gains made by those at the top, particularly the top 1%. And we did a lot to try and offset this with tax credits and other forms of public support. But we found ourselves swimming against bigger economic currents. Now, some people, I think, believe that the squeezed middle is a phrase I might never use again. But it isn't just a marketing concept. It is a reality of life for millions of people as a result of the economy we have. It speaks to families working hard for long hours, stretching a limited family budget, and who found the only way to increase their living standards was higher personal debt, which made them more exposed to the financial crisis when it came. And this is the really important lesson, that we always have talked about as a movement that inequality, the gap between rich and poor, is a social injustice. I think what the financial crisis showed is it actually leads to economic instability as well. And this has been true over the history of the financial crashes that we've seen, including in the 1920s. So the lesson we must draw is there is a connection between the inequality of a system that distributes wealth unfairly and the economic imbalances of a country that was too reliant on personal debt and financial services. So put these parts of the argument together about regulation, about the need for a broader industrial base, and about inequality, and I come to this conclusion. We can't build economic efficiency or social justice simply in the way that we have tried before when it comes to our future. New Labour's critical insight in the 1990s and 2000s was that we needed to be stewards of a successful market economy, I agree, to make possible social justice through redistribution. The critical insight of Labour in this generation has got to be that both wealth creation and social justice need to be built into the way our economy works. Now, what's an example of this? One example I would give is the living wage. Why is the living wage such a powerful idea? It's a powerful idea because it speaks to our sense of justice. It's a powerful idea because it speaks to the sense that hard work should be rewarded. It's a powerful idea because it didn't arise from some bunch of technocrats, of which I was one, in Whitehall. It arose from actually conversations in the community organizing movement in America. But it's also a powerful idea because it speaks to the sense that we want justice as part of the economy we run, not as an add-on or an optional extra after the fact. If we can build an economy with more living wage jobs and well-paying jobs, we put social justice at the heart of the way the market economy is run, rather than having to make it that optional extra. Now, you might say, well, why didn't we do that when we came to office? I think this is actually part of the sort of historical phenomenon of New Labour. New Labour was Labour's way of saying, look, we have made our peace with the idea that markets exist and can create wealth. But we weren't able, at the same time, to be the people who would say there are different forms of ways that markets can exist. There are different types of capitalism across the world, and some are more just than others. So this is incredibly important for us, in my view, because it's necessary to create social justice. We're never going to tackle inequality unless we put fairness at the heart of our economy, not as an afterthought through the welfare state. And it also reflects, frankly, the fiscal climate we face in the coming decade. And why was the last Labour government too slow in the language that we used after the financial crisis had created a big deficit to acknowledge what our own plans implied that would eventually have to be cut? Part of the answer, I think, lies deep in our traditions, that we hadn't shown other ways of delivering social justice. If you think about Tony Crosland and his book, The Future of Socialism, that was about the idea that you ran a market economy and you'd simply use the proceeds of growth to deliver fairness. Now, he thought that greater equality was embedded into the capitalist system and into the market economy, and he turned out to be wrong. But I'm saying we've got to take seriously economic reform to make the economy more just. And that is the first part of my argument. We must change to show how we can build a fair economy with wealth creation and social justice for all at its heart. The second part of our challenge is about our values, and to understand how over 13 years of government we came to seem detached and remote from instincts and values of families across Britain. For all our achievements, this is a problem that afflicts all governments. We became too technocratic and managerial. But more than that, we sometimes lost sight of people as individuals and the importance of communities. In our use of state power, we often didn't take people with us. I don't think anyone in the room would disagree with that. That's why people railed against the target culture, the managerialism of public service reform, and overbearing government. And in a way, I'm going to argue this in a second, that is part of, I'm afraid, parts of, I don't want to condemn the whole tradition, parts of the Fabian tradition. At the same time, though, New Labour brought its own tradition, which was to seem too in thrall to a vision of the market that seemed to place too little importance on the values, institutions, and relationships that people cherish the most. What do I mean by this? We became the people who were defending casinos. We became the people who seemed to be defending post office closures. And it was like we'd lost sight of the sense that these were part of the crucial social bonds of community. We talked about the benefits of a flexible and mobile labour force, but we didn't think enough about its impact on weakening social bonds and squeezing time with your family. So people began to see a government which looked remote from what they cared about. They could see a government doing things they agreed with or disagreed with, but not a political movement that spoke to our values. To change, we need to look critically at our traditions and why they led us to this point. And this is where I come to the Fabians. Among the many strands of the British Labour tradition, two have proved particularly influential. The first was the idea of socialism as a kind of missionary work to be undertaken on behalf of people. I don't want to give the Fabians a hard time genuinely, but this view is most obviously associated with Sidney and Beatrice Webb. There is an alternative strand represented by the cooperative movement and the early trade unions, which saw labour as a grassroots democratic movement to enable people to lead the most fulfilling lives. Now, I think it's really important to say this. The Webb tradition, the Webb-Fabian tradition, was born of an era where the challenge of the left was meeting people's basic needs for health, housing, education, and relief of poverty. That need is always going to remain. But actually, we can be more ambitious as a movement in the 21st century than we were in the 20th. Equally, the New Labour tradition, which embraced dynamic markets, is important for our future and creating wealth. But people, as I said, don't just care about the bottom line. There is so much more to life. So my argument is that the bureaucratic state and the overbearing market will not meet our real ambition as a political party. That each citizen can be liberated to have the real freedom to shape their own lives. To do that, we need to draw on that other tradition based on mutualism, localism, and the common bonds of solidarity that captures the essence of our party at its best. The belief in those common bonds means we should also be defenders of the things that people value and which are threatened, sometimes by the market, sometimes by government. So take an example. When we say we care about Sure Start, it's not simply because Sure Start delivers a good educational service to people. It's because it's the site, the place at which people meet and form a sense of bond and community. The same is true of local libraries. And the same is true of ways of life which are deeply ingrained in our country and which we should understand. Just before Christmas, believe it or not, I went with John Cruddas to Billingsgate Fish Market, not to buy fish for Christmas, but to talk to the porters there whose way of life is under threat, they feel, by changes that the Corporation of London are planning. And I met a guy there who said to me that the best day of his life was when he got his porter's badge. And every day since then, there hasn't been a day when he's woken up not feeling proud about the job he does. Now, a view that says that sort of markets should be given free rein doesn't give sufficient respect to that tradition and that idea and what he feels. And that's one of the lessons that we need to learn. We should seek to defend ways of life which give people a sense of self-respect. And talking of respect and decency, you can't build a sense of respect and decency in our country if there are people at the top who apparently feel no obligation to the rest of society. That is why what has been happening at Britain's banks and continues to happen is such a scandal. It's not simply about the fact that there was the bailout and that they are reliant on state money. It's actually about a deeper sense about what some of the bankers are expressing, that they have no social obligation to the rest of society. It's enough to say, I'll just take what the market will pay me, thank you very much. But that isn't how you build the society I believe in. It's got to be based on a much deeper sense of social obligation. I care about the success of our financial services, about the jobs it creates. But today, when you see some of our leading bankers constantly threatening to leave the country, trying to hold the country to ransom, and thinking only of themselves, it makes me angry. And it makes me even more angry that this government is failing to act on the scandal that we continue to see in our banking industry as well. So we need to draw on values that lie deep in our traditions, but we also need to reach out beyond our traditions as well. One of our tasks is to learn the lesson of the Green Movement and put sustainability at the heart of what we do. And another is to draw on the tradition of liberty. Progressive politics is not just about meeting economic and social needs. These are only ever a means to human flourishing and freedom. Part of it is about upholding the liberty of the person as well. Nobody should pretend there aren't important and difficult choices to be made about the balance between liberty and security. But we didn't take the need to uphold liberty seriously enough. In recent months, we have started to change, and we've shown our willingness to support the reduction of 28-day detention to 14 days. I am determined that we take liberty seriously as part of the governing philosophy of this party. So we need to change the way we approach the economy and change the way we think about our values. But thirdly, also, we have to reform our approach to politics as well. Let me be clear with you. I think not since the days of the rotten boroughs has politics and the political system been in such disrepute. If you look at declining turnout, shrinking electoral rolls, anger over broken promises, people have lost trust in politics. The most depressing thing for me when I knock on a door is actually not when people say they're voting for somebody else. That's depressing enough. But it's when people say, as so many people do, you're all the same. It's not going to make any difference to me voting for any of you. And actually the irony of Nick Clegg's broken promises and David Cameron's broken promises is it undermines trust in politics more widely, not just in them. Now, what are the roots of this crisis? It's a crisis of unreformed institutions, broken promises, remote political parties, and I also believe a knee-jerk adversarial political culture. Part of the problem has been the failure of all parties to honour repeated promises to usher in a new politics. That's why we've got to reform our political institutions. Let's be honest, our own credibility was undermined by our failure to honour our manifesto commitment on electoral reform and by the long-running saga of reform of the House of Lords. We will take every opportunity to reform the way our political system works. That's why I'll be campaigning for the alternative vote in the referendum, and I'll keep my promise to do it. But also, this audience knows from the work you do outside this room that very few people on the doorstep tend to ask about the alternative vote or the reform of the House of Lords. They think the reason politics is discredited is because politicians always break their promises, as I said. That's why we've got to be the people who under-promise and over-deliver. And I don't just mean in terms of the pledges we make, I also mean in terms of the rhetoric we use. And this is very tricky, but it's very important. Which is that if you promise people a transformation in their lives and then don't deliver it, it's no wonder that people get cynical about politics and what it can deliver to them. But that is just part of the story about how we renew our politics. Think back to our early days as a political party. I'm not saying you all remember it. Of course we fought elections, but we did a lot more than that. We were part of the fabric of community life through our wider movement, not just the trade unions, but the cooperative movement. Now, nostalgia for times past is not an answer to the challenges of the future. But this is the challenge for all of us, which is to be a genuine movement for change, appropriate to our time, up and down the country. We've got people here from London Citizens today. People will know about London Citizens and the work they do, not just on the living wage, but on a whole range of issues. We've got to learn the lessons. I think they deserve a round of applause. We've got to learn their lessons. We're a political party, not the same as London Citizens. But we've got to be the best community organisation movement in the country, because it's the only way we rebuild the case for politics from the ground up. The campaign for the local library, the local zebra crossing, the improvement of a school must be our campaign, and not just a campaign for the state to do things, but campaigns that achieve things in themselves. There's one other thing we need to change in our politics. No party has a monopoly of wisdom or virtue, and it is foolish to pretend that they do. I think the decision of the Liberal Democrats to join a Conservative-led government was a tragic mistake, and I hope they come to see that in time. Forgive me if I decline to join in this gloating at the expense of the Liberal Democrats, because actually their mistake means they are part of a government attempting to shift politics to the right in Britain. I'm certainly pleased that many Liberal Democrats now see Labour as the main vehicle for their hopes in the future. Thousands of former Liberal Democrat voters and supporters, voters and members have joined us since the election. I want them to find a welcome home in our party, not just making up the numbers, but contributing actively to the strengthening of our values and the renewal of our policies. But equally, there are many Liberal Democrats who have decided to stay and fight for the progressive soul of their party. Most of them do not want to see their traditions sacrificed for personal ambition. I respect their choice too, and I understand how painful it is and must be for them to watch what is happening to their party. We do not doubt that they hold sincere views, and we will cooperate in Parliament and outside it to fight with them against the direction of this government. In fact, it is our duty to work with progressives everywhere we can against what this government is doing. So this is the way I believe we need to seize the mantle of progressive politics and shape the economic, ideological, and political landscape of the future. It is about building a fair economy and learning the lessons of neoliberalism and what it has done to parts of our country. It is about rooting our values in traditions and ideas that go beyond the bureaucratic state and the overbearing market, and learning, if you like, the lessons of Fabianism and the need to go beyond it. And it is about a different kind of politics and learning the lessons of tribalism and sometimes the need to go beyond that too. The prize, in my view, is not simply a Labour government. It is a lot more than that. And this is my conclusion, final thought to you. You see, I think that when we think about what we want to achieve as a political party and as a group of progressives, it's not simply about the policies that we implement, important though that is. It's not simply about get back into government, important though that is. It is actually, and this is what the Conservatives set out to do in the 1970s, it is actually about changing the common sense of the age and influencing the common sense of the age. It's influencing people's values up and down this country so that they share our progressive ends. Now, I think, and this is my point of optimism, I think there is a progressive majority in this country. I think that was illustrated at the general election. But we need to become its standard bearer, and we've got work to do. But I also think the way we do that, not just over the coming years, but the way we sustain ourselves in government, is crucially as a genuine movement. Because if you are to avoid being a party that just governs for a bit and then gets chucked out, and then finds that you've got an ideological fight on your hands against the direction of the country, you've got to embed your values in people in every street, in every neighbourhood in this country. And you just can't do that simply from Westminster or Whitehall. Now, the Conservatives have their newspapers, which helps them to do that. Our best hope is people and a movement. And that's why this idea, this ambition about how we become a genuine community organising movement is so important. Because that is the way we influence people to make our values the common sense of the age. I approach this task with a profound sense of optimism. Because whatever this government is doing to our country, I don't think it's in tune with the values of the British people. And I think if we are willing to change, if we are willing to understand the lessons of history, if we are willing to look critically at ourselves, we can not only win the next general election, but we can shape a politics and a country that we can be proud of and that is true to our values of equality, social justice and fairness. Thank you very much.